Life in the quiet suburban neighborhood had always felt safe. Rows of perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and the occasional gossip about HOA rules were the only disturbances in an otherwise peaceful routine. I had moved into my new home just a few months earlier, excited to finally have a place to call my own. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, a modest, cozy house with a small garden and enough space for my family to grow. I took pride in maintaining it, ensuring every corner looked neat, every flower bed trimmed, and every rule of the HOA meticulously followed. At first, the neighbors seemed friendly enough. There were smiles exchanged over morning coffees and waves as we walked our dogs. But one neighbor immediately stood out. She was the type you never wanted to cross, the classic HOA Karen. From her perfectly coiffed hair to her immaculate wardrobe, everything about her screamed control. Her eyes constantly scanned the street, and her expressions shifted sharply if anyone dared to park slightly wrong or leave a garden hose out of place. At first, I thought I could navigate her strictness, keep to the rules, and avoid unnecessary confrontations. Things started subtly at first. I received a few notes slipped under my door, criticizing minor things: the garden edging is slightly crooked, or your trash cans are not hidden behind the fence. At the time, I laughed it off. Everyone has their quirks, I thought, and tried to stay compliant. But her attacks escalated in intensity and frequency. One afternoon, while I was at work, I got a call from a neighbor across the street. My house was engulfed in flames. Panic surged through me, and I rushed home, praying that it wasn't as bad as it sounded. When I arrived, the sight was worse than anything I could have imagined. Thick black smoke billowed from every window. The fire trucks had just arrived, and neighbors were gathering, some crying, some frozen in disbelief. My home, the place I had poured my heart into, was burning. Firefighters worked frantically to contain the blaze, but the damage was catastrophic. Everything I had worked for, my memories, my belongings, my sense of safety, seemed to be reduced to ashes in minutes. The police investigation began immediately. It didn't take long for them to suspect foul play. Evidence suggested the fire had been started deliberately, with accelerants traced back to the backyard of my HOA Karen neighbor. Shock and disbelief consumed me. How could someone harbor such hatred and go to such lengths? The thought that someone so close could destroy my life in an instant was unbearable. My dreams of peaceful suburban living were shattered, replaced by fear and anger. Insurance helped cover some of the losses, but the emotional toll was immeasurable. I was left with nothing but fragments of memories and a mounting determination to seek justice. The HOA, which I had once trusted to maintain order and civility, seemed indifferent at first, focusing on minor infractions rather than the severity of the crime. It became clear that I would have to take matters into my own hands and confront the situation legally. As I began gathering evidence and speaking to attorneys, the reality of the upcoming legal battle set in. I would have to face her in court, prove her malicious intent, and seek restitution for the devastation she had caused. The anticipation of that confrontation filled me with a mix of dread and resolve. I knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but justice was the only way to reclaim a sense of normalcy and closure. The night before the first court hearing, I sat in a temporary apartment, staring at the walls that felt so unfamiliar. I thought about my burned-down house, the life I had lost, and the neighbor who had orchestrated the nightmare. The irony of HOA rules seemed bitter now. She had wielded them as a weapon, turning community oversight into personal vengeance. The upcoming courtroom battle would not only decide the fate of my restitution but would also test the limits of civility, accountability, and the law in this quiet suburban world. The next week would change everything. The week after the fire, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. People exchanged hushed conversations over fences and in driveways, speculating about who could have done something so destructive. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others offered sympathy. But none of the reactions mattered as much as the reality that I was still processing the destruction of my home. I walked through the empty lot where my house once stood, kicking at the blackened remnants of the driveway, imagining the life that had vanished in an instant. Every step felt heavy with grief, every breath carried the acrid scent of smoke and loss. Insurance agents came and went, scribbling notes and taking photos, but their reassurances felt hollow. Paperwork could never replace the memories burned into those walls, the first painting my child had made, the furniture painstakingly chosen over months, the garden I had nurtured with care. Amidst the chaos, one thought loomed larger than any other: the person responsible had to be held accountable. I knew the evidence pointed toward my HOA Karen neighbor, but proving intent in court would be a different battle entirely. I started documenting everything. Every note she had sent, every interaction that had hinted at her hostility, every suspicious activity I could recall from the days before the fire. The more I compiled, the more a chilling picture emerged. This wasn't an accident, it was a calculated act. She had meticulously planned it, and the HOA environment had perhaps emboldened her. The thought that someone could channel the rules of a community organization into a tool for personal revenge made my stomach twist. Meanwhile, the HOA itself maintained a strange neutrality. They were quick to admonish minor infractions in the past but now remained mostly silent in the face of arson. Notices about small yard violations continued to arrive in my temporary mailbox, adding a surreal layer to the tragedy. It was as if the system that should have protected me had turned a blind eye to the most extreme abuse. This realization hardened my resolve to seek justice through the courts. I met with my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who immediately grasped the severity of the situation. Together, we went over the evidence, the fire report, and statements from neighbors who had seen suspicious behavior. The strategy was clear: prove that the act was deliberate, tie it to the HOA Karen neighbor, and seek full restitution for both the physical and emotional damages. The legal process would be long, draining, and emotionally taxing, but it was the only path forward. In the days leading up to the hearing, I couldn't escape the looming presence of the person responsible. The HOA Karen neighbor continued her daily routines, seemingly unbothered by the chaos she had caused. Her house remained pristine, her yard immaculate, a stark contrast to the smoldering ruin that had once been my home. Every time I caught sight of her from a distance, a wave of anger and disbelief surged through me. How could someone live so comfortably, so unrepentantly, after destroying another person's life? Then came the day I least expected. As I entered the courthouse for preliminary proceedings, there she was. Walking down the hall with a calm, almost casual stride, dressed in her usual perfection, she made direct eye contact with me. My heart raced. This was the same person who had taken everything from me, yet here she was, stepping into the very space where her actions would finally be scrutinized. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Every step she took seemed to echo the audacity of her crime. Court preparations consumed the rest of my day. Evidence had to be organized, statements reviewed, and legal arguments rehearsed. I could feel the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on me. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about reclaiming my sense of safety, asserting that no one, even under the guise of HOA authority, could destroy a life without consequence. The courtroom would be the stage for a battle far larger than mere property damage. It would test justice itself, the boundaries of neighborly conduct, and the courage required to face someone so brazen. As the evening fell, I left the courthouse and looked up at the quiet suburban street. The streetlights illuminated the rows of houses, including hers, untouched and flawless. The contrast between her world and mine could not have been starker. Yet I knew that next week, everything could change. Justice had a timetable, and the courtroom would be the arena where the scales would finally tip. The stage was set, courtroom day arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. The building, with its imposing marble columns and echoing hallways, felt like a fortress of justice. I walked inside, clutching my folders of evidence, each page a reminder of the life I had lost and the meticulous documentation I had compiled. Every corner of the courthouse seemed to whisper the gravity of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just a case about property, it was a confrontation with someone who had weaponized civility, rules, and power for personal revenge. As I entered the courtroom, I noticed the tension in the air. Lawyers conferred quietly, clerks shuffled papers, and the judge took their place, commanding attention without uttering a word. Then, my eyes met hers across the room. The HOA Karen neighbor was seated with an unsettling calm, her expression carefully neutral, almost smug. Her posture radiated control, the same control that had driven her to destroy my home. The juxtaposition was surreal, me, standing amidst the rubble of what was once mine, and her, perfectly poised, ready to defend her actions or deny them entirely. The proceedings began with formalities, the judge outlining the schedule and expectations. Then came the presentation of evidence. My attorney started methodically, walking the courtroom through the fire reports, neighbor statements, and the pattern of harassment that had escalated before the arson. Each piece of evidence built a narrative that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about property damage, it was about premeditation, malice, and abuse of perceived authority. The photographs of my burned home, contrasted with her pristine property, painted a stark story of the devastation she had caused. Throughout the session, I watched her closely. Her calm demeanor never wavered, but subtle gestures, a tightened grip on her papers, a sharp glance at a witness, betrayed a hint of unease. The courtroom observed her too. Whispers circulated quietly among spectators as the story unfolded, murmurs of disbelief at the audacity of someone committing arson and yet facing the consequences with such apparent nonchalance. The energy in the room was palpable, charged with a sense of impending judgment. Witnesses were called next. Neighbors recounted suspicious behaviors, unusual activities, and the escalating pattern of intimidation that had culminated in the fire. Each testimony reinforced the narrative my attorney had presented. The evidence was overwhelming, and it became increasingly clear that this was not a mere accident but a deliberate act of destruction. As witnesses described their shock and fear, the emotional weight of the situation pressed down on everyone present. I felt both vindicated and heartbroken, seeing the impact of the crime extend beyond my own loss. Her attorney began the defense, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence and question the motives behind my claims. Yet the meticulous documentation, combined with eyewitness accounts, made it difficult for them to construct a convincing argument. Every attempt to deflect or discredit only served to highlight the calculated nature of her actions. The contrast between her previous facade of neighborhood perfection and the reality of her malicious deeds became starkly evident. The courtroom was witnessing the unraveling of carefully maintained appearances, exposing the dangerous extremes that could hide behind suburban civility. The tension escalated as the judge asked pointed questions, probing inconsistencies and demanding clarity. The HOA Karen neighbor answered with a practiced calm, but the weight of proof was against her. Every statement, every document, every photograph served as a silent accusation, painting a narrative she could not escape. The courtroom, once an abstract concept of justice, now felt like a battlefield where truth and deception clashed. Each moment brought me closer to the possibility of accountability, a resolution to the nightmare that had upended my life. By the end of the day, it was clear that the case had shaken everyone involved. My attorney had presented a compelling argument, the evidence was substantial, and the witnesses had reinforced the narrative of deliberate malice. Yet the courtroom drama was far from over. The anticipation of the final judgment, the potential for restitution, and the confrontation with someone who had caused irreparable damage loomed large. As I left the courthouse that evening, the weight of what had transpired pressed down on me, but so did a cautious hope. Justice was within reach, and the upcoming days would determine if accountability would finally prevail. The battle was far from finished, but the scales were beginning to tip. The days following the initial court session were tense and emotionally draining. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the charred remains of my home. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the fire, the destruction, and the audacity of the HOA Karen neighbor who had caused it all. Yet, amidst the grief and frustration, there was a steely determination that had taken root. I refused to let fear or anger dominate my actions. I needed to be precise, methodical, and prepared for every twist the legal process might throw at me. As the case progressed, new details began to surface. Forensic experts confirmed the presence of accelerants, leaving no doubt that the fire was deliberate. Investigators pieced together timelines, reconstructing the moments leading up to the disaster. It became apparent that the HOA Karen neighbor had studied my routines, knew when the house would be empty, and had planned the act with chilling accuracy. Each revelation added fuel to the fire of my resolve. This wasn't just a random attack, it was a premeditated assault on my life, a calculated effort to inflict maximum damage. Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. Some neighbors offered support, sharing what they knew about her behavior and the tension she had created over time. Others, however, remained silent or cautious, wary of becoming entangled in the drama. The HOA itself continued to maintain a strange detachment, issuing reminders about minor infractions and community rules as if the fire had been a trivial incident. Their indifference only reinforced the reality that I could rely on no one but myself to see justice served. My attorney worked tirelessly, refining the legal strategy and preparing for the next hearing. Depositions were taken, documents meticulously reviewed, and every detail scrutinized. The courtroom would soon become a stage for a high-stakes confrontation, where evidence, testimony, and legal acumen would determine the outcome. I spent hours preparing. Emotionally as well, reminding myself to remain composed, focused, and resolute. The HOA Karen neighbor's calm facade could not be allowed to intimidate or distract me. On the day of the next hearing, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Spectators filled the benches, their murmurs blending into a low hum of anticipation. The judge entered, and the proceedings resumed with an air of solemnity. My attorney presented additional evidence, highlighting patterns of harassment and escalating hostility that preceded the fire. Photographs, emails, and witness statements painted a detailed portrait of a neighbor whose obsession with control had crossed into criminal behavior. The narrative was clear: this was a calculated act of vengeance. Her attorney attempted counterarguments, challenging the validity of the evidence and questioning the motives behind my claims. Yet, the consistency and thoroughness of my documentation left little room for doubt. Each objection was met with calm, factual responses, further exposing the deliberate nature of her actions. The courtroom watched closely, recognizing the stark contrast between her maintained composure and the overwhelming weight of the proof against her. Her reputation in the neighborhood, once carefully curated, began to unravel under scrutiny. The emotional intensity reached a peak as witnesses recounted their experiences. Neighbors described feeling intimidated, afraid, and on edge for months, recounting incidents of harassment, scrutiny, and verbal attacks. The testimonies revealed a pattern of obsession with perfection, an insistence on control, and a willingness to harm others to enforce her rigid standards. It became evident that the HOA Karen neighbor's behavior extended beyond my personal tragedy, affecting the broader community in insidious ways. By the end of the day, the courtroom atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The evidence had been laid bare, the narratives aligned, and the confrontation between truth and deception reached its zenith. As I left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. The fight was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. The next steps would bring the final confrontation, where accountability, justice, and closure would finally be within reach. The tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, as the stage was set for the ultimate showdown. The day of the final courtroom hearing arrived, carrying a weight that was almost unbearable. Months of emotional strain, legal preparation, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. As I entered the courthouse, I could feel every step echoing with anticipation and resolve. The rows of seats were filled with spectators, neighbors curious and tense, their eyes shifting between the judge, the attorneys, and the two parties at the center of the storm. The air was thick with the collective expectation of justice. From the moment she walked in, the HOA Karen neighbor projected the same calm, composed exterior she always maintained. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tells betrayed a flicker of anxiety, an edge that had not been visible in previous hearings. She knew what was at stake, and perhaps for the first time, the carefully controlled image she had curated was beginning to crack under the pressure. The courtroom became a stage where every gesture, glance, and word carried weight, amplifying the tension in the room. The proceedings began with the presentation of final evidence. My attorney carefully laid out a chronological sequence of events, highlighting the escalating harassment, the meticulous planning of the fire, and the direct connection to her actions. Photographs of the charred remains of my house, juxtaposed with documents detailing her repeated complaints and surveillance of my property, painted an undeniable picture of deliberate malice. Every piece of evidence reinforced the narrative that this was no accident, no coincidence, but a targeted attack orchestrated with precision. Witnesses were brought forward, each recounting incidents that had previously seemed minor but now formed a pattern of obsession and intimidation. The stories of late-night surveillance, petty confrontations, and relentless enforcement of HOA rules culminated in a chilling portrait of her relentless control. The courtroom felt the emotional gravity of these testimonies, the weight of fear and frustration that had built over months, now converging in one undeniable reality: my neighbor's actions were calculated and deliberate. Her attorney attempted to sow doubt, questioning timelines, challenging witness credibility, and presenting alternative explanations. Yet the clarity of the evidence, combined with the consistency of accounts, left little room for successful defense. Every objection was met with fact, with documentation, with testimony that reinforced the deliberate nature of her actions. The courtroom slowly became aware that the story was not merely one of property damage, but of power abused, trust betrayed, and lives upended. As the final arguments were presented, I could feel the tension reach a crescendo. My attorney spoke with unwavering confidence, summarizing the devastation, the premeditation, and the emotional toll of the crime. The narrative was undeniable: a neighbor's obsession with control had escalated to criminal behavior, leaving destruction in its wake. The HOA Karen neighbor's silence, her composed exterior, and her attempts to maintain innocence could not mask the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The judge, deliberate and focused, reviewed the documentation, listened to the testimonies, and considered the arguments presented by both sides. The anticipation in the room was palpable, each second stretching longer as the decision approached. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered a measured, firm response. Accountability was affirmed. The HOA Karen neighbor was held responsible for the fire, for the calculated destruction, and for the emotional distress inflicted. Restitution and penalties were ordered, a tangible acknowledgement of the devastation she had caused. The moment of verdict brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief, vindication, and a cautious sense of closure washed over me, tempered by the memories of loss that could never be fully erased. For the first time since the fire, there was a sense of justice, a recognition that deliberate harm could not go unpunished. The courtroom, once a site of tension and confrontation, became a space of resolution, where accountability had triumphed over malice. As I left the courthouse, I glanced back at the HOA Karen neighbor, her expression unreadable yet undeniably altered. The calm, composed facade had cracked, revealing the impact of her actions and the reality of justice served. Outside, the sun shone over the neighborhood, the quiet streets now carrying the echo of a story that had tested the limits of civility, power, and retribution. The stage was set for the final chapter, where the aftermath of devastation and justice would come into full view. The days after the verdict were surreal. Walking through the neighborhood, I noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Whispers of the court case lingered, neighbors sharing their impressions and reflections on what had transpired. Some expressed relief that justice had been served, while others marveled at the audacity of the HOA Karen neighbor's actions and the consequences that followed. Though the fire had destroyed my home, the court decision offered a sense of validation, a recognition that deliberate harm could not go unpunished, even in a community bound by rules and appearances. Rebuilding life after the fire became my new focus. The insurance payout and court-ordered restitution provided the financial means to begin reconstruction, but the process was far more than a physical restoration. Each brick laid, each wall painted, and each garden replanted was an act of reclaiming control over a life that had been violently disrupted. The emotional scars, though invisible, were addressed through reflection and a newfound resilience. I learned to navigate grief while embracing the small victories of progress, step by step, day by day. Meanwhile, the HOA Karen neighbor faced the consequences outlined in the court's judgment. Fines, restitution, and restrictions were imposed, limiting her ability to exert control in the community. Though the law could not erase the trauma she had caused, it sent a clear message: malice and abuse of authority would not be tolerated. Her carefully maintained image of perfection now bore the weight of accountability, a stark reminder that no one is above the consequences of deliberate wrongdoing. The neighborhood slowly began to heal as well. Conversations shifted from fear and gossip to reflection and cautious optimism. Others in the community, previously intimidated by her behavior, felt emboldened to assert boundaries and maintain a sense of personal agency. The incident served as a cautionary tale, demonstrating the extremes of obsession, control, and abuse within the framework of HOA regulations. It reminded everyone that rules, when weaponized, can harm as much as they protect, and that vigilance, documentation, and courage are vital in protecting oneself. Personally, the experience instilled a renewed sense of resilience. I had faced an unimaginable loss, confronted deliberate malice, and navigated a complex legal battle, emerging with a sense of justice and empowerment. Life was no longer the same as it had been before the fire, but there was a newfound clarity about boundaries, accountability, and the strength required to stand firm in the face of adversity. The rebuilt home was more than a structure, it was a symbol of survival, determination, and the restoration of control over my own life. Looking back, the fire, the courtroom battle, and the confrontation with the HOA Karen neighbor became defining moments. They revealed the fragility of appearances, the extremes of human behavior, and the power of persistence and truth. Justice had not erased the trauma, but it had restored a sense of balance and reinforced the principle that deliberate harm cannot go unanswered. The neighborhood, my home, and my life had endured, and while scars remained, so did strength, resilience, and the knowledge that accountability prevails in the end. As the sun set over the rebuilt house, I stood in the garden, taking in the quiet streets that had once been the scene of devastation. The ordeal was over, but the lessons remained vivid. In a world where appearances often mask intent, vigilance, documentation, and courage are indispensable. And while HOA rules can enforce order, it is the moral and legal responsibility of individuals to ensure that power is not misused. My story, though harrowing, had a resolution, a reclaiming of justice, and a testament to the enduring strength of those who refuse to be victims of deliberate malice. The chapter of devastation had closed, and a new chapter of resilience, restoration, and vigilance had begun.